Hello and welcome to this class on compression. The first thing we need to investigate and learn about is what is compression and why do we use it? Well, as the name suggests, compression is all about making something big into something smaller. So we're compressing down the size. And there's been previous classes on calculating file sizes in terms of images and sound files. So if we've got an image file with lots of detail in it, it's going to take a lot more memory to store that information, isn't it? So we're going to end up with a pretty large file size. That's great. We have a really good quality image, but if I wanted to store it on a device, it's going to take up a lot of room. Okay. Also, if I wanted to send you and show off this picture to you, and I email it through to you, or I send it through another means, it's going to take a long time to send. Sending large files take a lot of time. So it makes sense that we take our image, our file, and compress it down to make it smaller. It frees up more space on our device so we can store more photos, for example, on our phones or computers, but also it makes sending files a lot quicker for starters and a lot easier as well. So there are the main reasons why we actually use compression. We actually need to learn about two types of compression. And for that, I just need to share my whiteboard like so. Okay, two types of compression that we're going to need to know. The first is something called lossy. The second is called lossless. Lossy and lossless. And I'll explain the differences between the two. Lossy is where we take a file and compress it and we permanently delete data. We delete the information that we don't really require in order to reduce that file size right down to something a lot more convenient, a lot more smaller. But let me explain. Imagine we have a Photoshop file, okay? So we have lots of layers in our Photoshop file, our PSD file, for example. Maybe here's the background, some rolling hills, and this one got some trees, and we might have a character in the foreground, and we might have, I don't know, a car. Okay, so we've got loads of different layers. Now we're going to save that in Photoshop, and that's going to be a huge file size. It's going to be so big because each layer is in its own right, its own separate image. So we're going to need to somehow squash all those images down into one single layer. So we compress it, okay? And using lossy compression, we're able to permanently delete the data that we don't need. And in terms of our image, the data that we don't need might be this area behind the car because we don't see it. Yeah, so when we squash all those layers down, we don't need to know what's behind the car because we don't need to see it. Likewise, you know, the scenery and the hills behind the person, we don't need to see. And with regards to the hills, for example, the area, the information of what's behind the tree, we don't need either because we're not going to bother ourselves with it. We don't need to see it, do we? So that's how we can reduce the file size by permanently deleting data. And a good example of a compressed image file is, I'm sure you've all come across them, JPG files, JPEG files. And it's the same with music. Imagine these layers are different instruments. Maybe we have the vocals and this layer, the drums in the background and the guitars and whatever. Okay, if someone's really going at it with the drums and drowning out the guitar at the time, then we don't need that information regarding the guitar, do we? Because we can't hear it. So again, we're able to squash all those tracks down, all those different layers in that music down into one single layer, and permanently deleting the information that we don't actually need regarding each instrument. An MP3 is a good example of a compressed music file. So with lossy, we are permanently deleting data to reduce the file size. And a good example of file types when it comes to images is a JPEG. And a good example of a music file that's been compressed is an MP3. So lossy, the main advantage of lossy compression is that we're able to reduce the file size quite a bit. So we're able to take a big file and reduce it considerably. But there are a couple of disadvantages with that. As you can probably already guess, a Photoshop file has a lot of detail in it. But when we compress it down and we start shedding all this information to reduce the file size, a JPEG is still really good quality, but it is at a reduced quality setting. Okay, so it's not as detailed or as good quality as the original. Same with MP3s and the music files, although most of us won't be able to tell the difference. But if you were to play like an MP3 music file through some really high-end speakers, maybe in a recording studio, for example, you might be able to pick up the difference. So that's one disadvantage. The other disadvantage that you need to learn about when it comes to lossy compression is that we're not able to get back to the original state. So we can't take a JPEG, for example, and reverse engineer it to get back to all those different layers in a Photoshop file. Once it's compressed, that's it. We permanently lose the information that we discard. There's no way of getting it back. Okay, so we're able to considerably reduce the file size, but as a consequence, we have to suffer a loss of quality, and also we're not able to get back to a copy of the original. So that's lossy compression. Just bear with me a second while I delete all these. And that one. We now move on to lossless compression. Okay, and now this one's slightly different to what we've just discussed with lossy. Lossless is where we're still able to compress a file, but the key difference here is that we're able to get back to the original. Okay, lossless. So we're able to take a file and still remove information from that file to reduce the file size, but we do it in a more structured, logical way that those missing gaps that that result from us removing data, we're able to sort of piece it back together at the other end. Okay, so an advantage of lossless compression is that we're able to get back to an original copy of what was originally compressed in the first place. Unfortunately, whilst we do reduce the file size, we don't reduce it that much, or not as much as lossy. And the way I remember the two, lossless, we lose less data. Okay, so we still are able to compress and reduce a file down, but not as much as, say, lossy. So lossless, we lose less data. And those two are the two main types of compression methods that you'll need to learn. In the next classes, we're going to look at two methods of compression and again discuss the advantages and disadvantages of each. But I hope you found this introduction to compression useful. Take care now. Bye-bye.